Chapter 8. Much to Holly's surprise, they made it all the way to the infirmary without any major difficulties. Madame Pomfrey was waiting for her arrival. "The other students said you had fallen too," she announced, "so I wondered when you'd make it here. I'll be keeping Holly here for a while," she told Mark and Becky, "so come back and check on her before dinner." "Dinner!" exclaimed Becky. "I forgot. We're supposed to have tea with Hagrid today." So Becky and Mark went off to Hagrid's hut, leaving Holly with Madame Pomfrey. Madame Pomfrey ushered Holly into the infirmary and sat her down on a curtained bed. She drew her wand and said muffliato. She put her wand away. "Now we won't be heard. Let me look at your head." After a quick examination, she determined it was only a nasty bump. She opened a jar that had a thick, reddish-looking goo that smelled like dirty socks. She rubbed the goo onto Holly's forehead. Immediately, the throbbing pounding ceased. "Now," said Madame Pomfrey when she had finished putting the jar away, "tell me about the accident." "There isn't much to tell," replied Holly. "One moment I was flying with the wind, and the next I was on the ground screaming. I never saw it happen." And where was your cat?" She began Holly guiltily. "Sasha was on the ground. I wasn't sure I could safely balance myself on the broom, let alone balance the two of us. I haven't had too much problems being around the Gryffindors before. I thought I could handle it." "I see. Well, Madam Hooch said you didn't stop screaming until all the other injured students had left the field. That's an impressive range, by the way. But if you plan to watch the Quidditch matches, I recommend you sit on the top benches in the back and bring Sasha. That way you'll be prepared should something happen, and it often does." "Yes, ma'am." "Now, tell me about the injuries." "What?" "The other student injuries. What did you feel while you were on the ground?" "Oh, Holly thought back. "Well, there was a sharp pain in my arms here." She pointed to a spot below her elbow, "and one higher up on my shoulder." Madame Pomfrey nodded. "That's Miss Mackenzie's broken arm, and the other side would be Mr. Finnegan's wrenched shoulder. And then on my knee," Mr. O'Toole landed on his knee, dislocating it. "And then my stomach was like on fire." That would be Miss Ross. She got rammed in the stomach with a broomstick. "And then my body felt like somebody had been pounding all over it." There was a whole stack of minor cuts and bruises from the other students. "When did the pain leave?" After I started focusing on Sasha's purr." "Right." Madame Pomfrey gently lifted Sasha off Holly's lap. "Now, I want you to try something. Can you feel the other students?" "Yes, but they don't hurt so much." "That's because they're already on the mend. Can you tell me which injury is where?" Holly closed her eyes and concentrated. Finally, she shook her head. "No," she said. "It's just a blur of pain all around me." "That's okay," said Madame Pomfrey easily. "Just keep working on it." She returned Sasha to Holly. "Why don't you lie down and rest for a while? Then when your friends return, you can go with them. You shouldn't need to return tomorrow. How about next Monday instead?" Holly nodded, and then she lay down in her bed. She really was quite tired. Becky and Mark returned for Holly. The three took off for dinner. Along the way, Becky and Mark told Holly about their tea with Hagrid. "He was really sorry to hear you were hurt," began Becky, "so he invited us back again next week. That way you could come too." "I saved you a biscuit," said Mark. "Here." He pulled out a lump of light brown stuff the size of a hockey puck and handed it to Holly. "Careful," he warned. "Darn near broke my teeth on mine." Holly quickly pocketed the biscuit without eating it. Mark continued talking. "Hagrid had a huge bucket of scutworms." "Creepy, maggoty things with huge pincers for mouths," cut in Becky, shivering at the mere mention of them. "He was feeding his new baby pet, a spitting monitor lizard," continued Mark. "Deep emerald green with a bright orange and red belly. Only about a foot long," added Becky. "They're supposed to be rather common with yellow bellies. But Hagrid said the orange-bellied ones are rare. He was really excited to have it. It looked really cute." "Cute, right," put in Mark, "until it started spitting. Look at my shirt." He pulled out his shirt for Holly to examine. The shirt was full of tiny little holes. "That thing spit out acid," he complained. Becky giggled. "Maybe you shouldn't try to pick it up while it's facing you." Then she was serious. "Hagrid says it isn't going to get very large. But I've read about regular monitor lizards in school. They can get as big as crocodiles and alligators." Mark snorted. "Hagrid probably thinks a 3-meter-long lizard is small." Holly laughed. "You're probably right," she said. By this time they had reached the great hall and went in for dinner. Holly attended her first official Hufflepuff house meeting on Friday afternoon. The Hufflepuffs apparently met once a week to discuss anything of interest to the group as a whole. At this meeting, the Quidditch team members were announced. Everyone heartily cheered the names. The dates and times of the Quidditch practice was also announced, and anyone with free time was encouraged to watch and cheer them on. Prefect Gwyn announced another wand practice Saturday after lunch for interested students, and Prefect Ben handed out the next week's homework assignments for Professor Ben's class so students could get an early start on it. Professor Longbottom tells me he will be cleaning out the greenhouse tomorrow, in case anyone would like to help. Gwyn looked over at Susan when she spoke. He says he saw a lot of bugs there earlier. Susan Braesbury smiled happily at the news. By now it was pretty obvious to everyone that Susan liked bugs. She was rarely without an insect of some sort, and when she wasn't watching live insects in action, she was reading about them or drawing them. The Slytherins had given up trying to harass Susan, after she eagerly caught the cicada some Slytherin boy had snuck into her bag to scare her, and proudly displayed it for the rest of the day. "And about the Slytherins," continued Gwyn, "it seems as if they are up to their usual ways of bullying and harassment, and have gotten an early start on it this year. Complaining to the teachers only makes them worse. We can't change the nature of Slytherins, so the best way to avoid trouble with the Slytherins is to travel in groups, especially you first years." Gwyn looked at Holly directly. "I know you missed the first meeting, Holly, but the Slytherins sometimes act like a pack of wolves, circling around trying to find the weakest students. When they find someone they think is vulnerable, they proceed to make his or her life misery. Now, I've said this before, and I will say it again. The best way to avoid harassment is to travel in groups. I know you have to make special trips to the infirmary to meet with Madame Pomfrey, but you can't do it alone, Holly." "But," began Holly. "No buts, Holly," said Gwyn sternly. "Richards has already marked you as easy prey, and he's likely to try something whenever he finds you alone. We don't want a repeat of Monday night." "You know about Monday night?" said Holly, astonished. She hadn't said a word about that to anyone. "Of course we do," said Ben. "That's our job. We look out for each other and keep each other safe. Prefects have a lot of extra power, and the Slytherin prefects tend to abuse that power. Now, we're not saying you have to travel in groups, but around here, students who travel in groups are less likely to be harassed by the Slytherins, so it's the safe thing to do. You can't count on a Gryffindor popping up to the rescue next time. So be careful and be safe." "Okay." "Now," concluded Gwyn, "does anyone have anything else to add?" Becky punched Holly lightly in the shoulder. "Come on," she whispered encouragingly. "Tell them. It'll be okay," she assured Holly. "Yeah," whispered Mark on the other side. "Tell them." I do," said Holly hesitantly. All eyes turned to Holly expectantly. Holly took a deep breath. "It's about that Gryffindor." "The Potter boy? What about him?" "He's, my cousin." "What?" Everyone started talking at once. "Since when? James doesn't have any cousins, not from Muggle parents." Even with Sasha on her lap purring loudly, Holly could feel waves of disbelief surround her. It was overwhelming. Holly wilted under its pressure. She began to sob quietly. This was what she'd been afraid of. "Lighten up, everyone," spoke up Mark defensively. "She's an empath, remember?" "Well, it's a pretty outlandish thing for her to say," said Rupert Shunpike, a fifth-year student. "Not necessarily," spoke out a deep voice. "What do you mean, Roland?" asked Stephen Willits. Stephen was a big seventh-year student, and his voice was even deeper than Roland's. "Well," began Roland DeWitt, "Holly doesn't strike me as an attention-seeking liar, and it would explain why the Potter boy walked Holly almost all the way back to the dorms. They had something to say to each other besides hello." "But cousins? Honestly?" chimed in Rupert's younger brother, Eddie. He was third year. "I do seem to recall reading that Harry Potter went to live with his Muggle aunt and uncle after his parents died," mused Steve. Several of the older students nodded in agreement. Maybe they had family. Roland asked Holly directly, "Your grandparents Harry Potter's aunt and uncle?" Holly gulped and nodded, afraid to look up, but thankful that somebody might finally believe her. "Then," he concluded firmly, "she and James are definitely cousins. Second cousins, to be sure, but cousins all the same." The disbelief in the room faded. Holly could breathe normally again. "But I don't understand," began Clayton Eggleton, a fourth-year student. "Even with Muggles as parents, surely Harry Potter would have known, and the Ministry of Magic would have been watching. Why the late admission to school?" Holly took another deep breath and began to explain what little she knew of the situation, how apparently her family had been magically hidden over 20 years ago from Lord Voldemort. Everyone drew in a deep breath at the mention of that name, and only recently reconnected with Harry Potter. "I didn't know I had a cousin named Harry Potter until last week when I woke up in the hospital. And I don't think he knew about me either," concluded Holly. "Well," said Gwen, sitting back in her chair, "this is quite a story, but I'm glad you told us. It explains a lot. I'm sorry we gave you a bit of a bad time there." The whole group nodded. "But if they are really your cousins," voiced Julie Ross, another first-year student, "why weren't they there to greet you when you arrived? Are they ashamed of you or something?" Holly turned and looked at Julie directly. "Oh, I don't know," she said sarcastically. "New kid on the block, from a Muggle family, knows nothing about wizards and such, arrives a week late. These complete strangers come walking up saying, 'Hiya, cuz,' and suddenly I'm the subject of all sorts of whispers and finger-pointing behind my back, all because I'm related to some famous person I'd never heard of before and barely met 3 days earlier. Frankly," she continued, "I'm glad they didn't." There was complete silence at this. Then Gwen stood up. "You're right, Holly," she said. "We have been rather rude to the Potters, and we should apologize. And we certainly wouldn't want that to happen to you. As far as I'm concerned, you are Holly Wycliffe, not Holly Potter." There came a chorus of "Hear, hear," and with that the group broke up. "You really got to go shopping with Harry Potter?" asked Susan, catching up with Holly after the meeting. "That must have been exciting." "It would have been much more exciting had I known he was famous at the time. Mostly I was worried about going to a wizard's school," responded Holly. "So, what was he like? Cousin Harry?" "Yes," said Susan eagerly. "I don't know," replied Holly. "He seemed pretty normal, I guess. He didn't talk much and was very polite. He was not at all what I'd expect from somebody who is supposed to be famous." Susan nodded knowingly. "That's what everyone else who has met him says about Harry Potter. I just couldn't believe it was really true." The next week went much smoother, especially since Holly knew the ropes and the location of each class. With the help of Becky and Rupert, Holly fashioned a small bag that she could wear on her back like a backpack, so Sasha could ride along with her during broomstick practice. The students were much more sedate with their broomsticks than during the previous week. Madam Hooch had set up an elaborate obstacle course. It was a complicated path of loops, turns, tunnels, high and low places. "This course is designed for proficiency on a broom. When you are more familiar with the course," informed Madam Hooch, "I'll be raising it higher off the ground. When you can run this course without falling or touching anything and do it under 10 minutes, then you graduate from this class. Today," she told the class, "we will not be timing anyone. We will just practice taking the course. If you fall, go back to the beginning and start again. If you hit another student, you have to start again." One by one the students lined up to try the course. It was a challenge for everyone. Most of the students, Holly included, inched their way through the course, trying hard to not fall. The better students had to dodge around the slow ones while staying on the course. There were lots of spills and falls, but the course was low to the ground, so no one was seriously hurt. No one had finished the course by the time Madam Hooch blew her whistle and declared the class ended. "Hey, Holly," said Albus, catching up with her as they left the class. Holly halted. Though they knew each other by name, Albus had never before talked to Holly directly. "Can we tag along with you to Hagrid's for tea?" Sure, I guess." Holly looked at Becky and Mark for confirmation. They both nodded in agreement. "If it's okay with Hagrid." "Oh, he won't mind," said Albus cheerfully. "He always has plenty of food and loves the company. Besides, I already asked him and he said it was okay, as long as it was okay with you." So the five, Albus, Rose, Becky, Mark, and Holly, walked over to Hagrid's hut for tea. "Have you seen Hagrid's new spitting monitor lizard?" Albus asked Mark excitedly. Yeah," replied Mark. Soon the two were deep in conversation, comparing notes about spit holes in their clothes and guessing what else the acid would dissolve. Becky happily showed off her new wand to Rose, who had noted that Becky had a different wand and wanted to hear all about Becky's trip with Hagrid to London. Holly contentedly listened to the conversation, soaking up the pleasant emotions that swirled around her. Hagrid was indeed expecting all 5, and already had 5 huge mugs waiting to be filled with tea. Holly and the others squished themselves in 2 huge chairs and related all the news of the week. Hagrid listened with interest while he pulled out some large, lumpy-looking biscuits and gave them to the students. Rose quickly pocketed her biscuit. "They work great as air purifiers, especially in the potions class," she whispered to Holly. Holly smiled and quietly put her biscuit away in a pocket, too. They sure could have used one of those during potions yesterday. They had been trying to mix a basic sleeping potion when Susan's concoction suddenly erupted, sending an explosion of muddy lime-green foam throughout the classroom. The stuff landed in the cauldrons of other students, causing a chain reaction of other explosions throughout the room. When the explosions stopped, the smell had started. The cooling foam had sent up a stench so foul it sent the students fleeing outside. Only Holly had managed to turn in a completed potion, much to Professor Slughorn's delight. 5 house points for Hufflepuff. Holly had sat on the far side of the room. She had managed to cover her cauldron with her body when the explosions started. Then she calmly finished bottling and handing in her potion before the stench had driven her out. Of course, Holly's robe and clothes got covered with gunk, and she didn't have time to change before her next period. This enabled the Slytherins to make several snide comments about Holly's appearance and smell during charms. Professor Flitwick was angry about the disruption. He took away 5 house points from all the students involved. Hufflepuff lost 5, Holly, and Slytherins lost 10. Both Anthony Richards and Scorpius Malfoy could be heard making nasty comments. When the tea was finished, the students moved outside to watch the spitting monitor lizard. Hagrid had named it Cuddles. The lizard was lying in a patch of swampy muck that Hagrid had made especially for it and was anything but cuddly. The lizard had more than doubled in size in a single week. Mark and Albus tried their hand at feeding it while dodging great gobs of spit while everyone else watched. Rose stood a safe distance away and pulled out a bottle of Skin Grow, just in case the spit landed on someone. Seeing how the spit kept on flying and leaving smoking holes in the ground and nearby trees, Holly and Becky soon joined Rose, preferring the safety of distance over a good view. James came by with his friend Lawrence Prescott and joined them after their classes ended for the day. Lawrence was a bit shorter than James, but just as slender. He had light brown hair and blue eyes. They were in time to help the group feed the Thestrals. Everyone helped fill some buckets with raw meat and then followed Hagrid into the forest. James pulled Holly to the back of the line for a quiet word while they walked. "What did you say to the Hufflepuffs?" he asked. "I've had 3 of them come up to me this week and apologize. I'm not sure what they're apologizing for." "I didn't say anything," said Holly. "I just told them you were my cousin, and they decided they had been rather rude to point and whisper behind your back." "Oh," said James. "Thanks. Have you ever seen a Thestral eat?" he asked, changing the subject. "No," replied Holly. She didn't even know what a Thestral was. They had reached a clearing in the forest and were watching Hagrid place pieces of raw meat on the ground. "Me neither," said James with a laugh. "And that's the way it should be. Look," he commanded, directing her attention to the meat. To Holly's amazement, bits of meat lifted into the air, only to vanish. "They're invisible," James said with delight. In silence, the group watched the Thestrals feed, or rather, they watched the meat vanish piece by piece. When the meat was all gone, it was time to return to school. Dear Holly. Laurel stopped. This was not a letter she wanted to write, but Dylan had been adamant. How to put this without sounding cold-hearted? Your father and I love you very much and have enjoyed hearing from you. That was true. Holly had sent 3 letters so far, and they had eagerly read every word. It was the owls that seemed to bother Dylan. Whenever an owl arrived, and it was such a tiny thing, Dylan would flinch and cringe. Laurel would have to retrieve its message and attach any reply to the owl's leg. Once the owl had flown off, Dylan would be back to his cheerful self, as if nothing had happened. But Dylan had gotten increasingly agitated with the arrival of each owl, finally forcing Laurel to write this letter. Laurel didn't mention it to Dylan, but Holly's letters home were a bit strange. Here she was attending a school of witchcraft and wizarding, and not one word in any of Holly's letters reflected this. Her second letter mentioned a tea she had attended with her friends at Professor Hagrid's house, where they got to feed the professor's pet lizard. Dylan had blanched a bit at the name Hagrid. Did Dylan know Hagrid? Holly said she met her cousins James and Albus and their cousins Rose. She said they seemed nice enough. In her last letter, Holly described a school Quidditch match. Her house, the Hufflepuffs, had made a spectacular win when a member of their team had snatched the golden ball just in the nick of time, winning the game. Laurel had gotten suspicious after the second letter and decided to try her new journal to Harry Potter. "Did you tell Holly to not talk about wizard things in her letters home?" she asked. The reply was brief. Tell, no. Suggest, yes. This prompted another message to the Potters. "What classes is Holly taking?" The reply was equally brief. Potions, astronomy, herbology, the history of magic, charms, transfigurations, and defense against the dark arts. After studying the list, Laurel decided maybe it was best Holly not describe what she was learning in her classes. But it was his parents that worried Dylan so much. They were coming home in a few days, and Dylan was adamant they not know about Holly attending Hogwarts. "So don't tell them," was Laurel's response, but that wasn't enough. Dylan was afraid an unexpected arrival of an owl would give the secret away. "No one else but Hogwarts uses owls," he assured Laurel. The two had gone round and round about this problem, with Laurel seeking other solutions. Maybe they could set up a specific time and day or location to ensure his parents weren't around when an owl arrived. Anything. But Dylan was just too afraid. Dylan's parents seemed like such nice people. Surely Dylan was blowing this all out of proportion. Laurel had even tried to consult Harry Potter concerning the matter, but he only replied, "Dylan knows his parents best." Hence the letter. "Unfortunately, your grandparents are arriving home from their cruise shortly. They apparently do not approve of Hogwarts or anything related to it. Your father is afraid that an unexpected arrival of an owl in their presence might create all sorts of difficulties, and has requested that you not send us any more mail for the time being." There. She had written it. Laurel felt as if she had just cut off her hand in doing it. How could she bear to not hear from Holly? How could Dylan? But he had insisted on the letter, and now stood over her while she wrote it. He looked positively sick the whole time. "We still love you very much and look forward to your return during the holidays. Love, Mum and Dad." Laurel rolled the letter up, placed it in the waiting talons of the tiny owl in front of her. "Holly Wycliffe," she whispered, and the owl flew off. Holly read the letter again before folding it up. Her grandparents? But they were so nice. How could they not? Then she remembered how she had worried Mum and Dad wouldn't love her if she became a witch, and that panicked question Dad had asked Harry Potter in the car about what to tell his parents. Apparently it wasn't a joke at all when Mr. Potter had suggested Dad not mention the name of the school. "What's wrong?" asked Mark, noting the solemn look on Holly's face. Holly silently handed him the letter. Mark read it quickly. "That's rough," he said, as he passed the letter on to the next person in the table, Julie Ross. "Does that mean they won't write to you either?" Holly shook her head silently. She didn't know, but doubted they would write. She would miss their letters terribly. "What kind of grandparents are they?" chimed in Julie after reading the letter. "Don't they love you?" Julie handed the letter to Becky. "I thought so," mumbled Holly. Maybe love wasn't enough. "But how can they do that?" said Becky after she had read the letter, passing it down the table. "Your parents. That's like cutting you off totally." "Not totally," added Rupert, showing the letter to the next person. "They still want to see you for the holidays." "But it's so weird," said Donna. "I've never heard of such a thing. Have you?" She handed the letter to Ben. "Actually, I have," said Ben after he read the letter. "Sort of." "Me too," agreed Roland when he looked at the letter. "I've heard that sometimes wizard families are so ashamed when someone in their family is born without wizard skills that they hide that person away in the muggle world and deny he or she even exists. I suppose the reverse can happen too." Ashamed, thought Holly. Were her grandparents ashamed? It could explain why they had never heard of Mr. Potter. But it's the grandparents, not the parents, said Gwen, handing the letter back to Holly. There must be something we can do. I have an idea, said Becky excitedly. Just let me check with my parents first. 7 days later, Laurel went to her mailbox and pulled out a rather bulky letter. It was hand-addressed to Mr. and Mrs. Wycliffe. The return address indicated the letter was from a Mr. and Mrs. Charles Smith. Laurel didn't know any Smiths. Intrigued, she opened the letter. There was a second letter within the first. Laurel's heart skipped a beat when she recognized the handwriting on the second letter. It was Holly's. With trembling fingers, Laurel opened the letter. Dear Mom and Dad, Mr. and Mrs. Smith are the parents of my best friend Becky. They are not wizards. If you want to write to me, you can send the letter to them, and they will forward it on to me at Hogwarts. I will do the same. I love you and can't wait to see you during the holidays. Holly. Laurel could feel the tears streaming down her face. Her clever, wonderful Holly had found a solution to their problem. She folded the letter and returned it to the envelope. She couldn't wait to show Holly's letter to Dylan when he got home. Then Laurel went back inside the house to write a long letter to Holly. The days in October slipped by easily. Holly had her friends and her family. School became a matter of routine. Holly now knew the classes and teachers. While not particularly great in potions, Professor Slughorn seemed pleased every time Holly got a potion right. Holly took to practicing regularly in the Defense Against the Dark Arts practice room. She got Mark and Becky to join her. Holly often saw Professor Lovegood hanging from the skeleton reading, and the trio stopped regularly to look at the motionless painting outside the door. Becky liked it too. Soon other Hufflepuffs made their way to the room to practice. Their efforts showed during class exercises, much to the dismay of the Slytherins, who constantly sought excuses to belittle the Hufflepuffs. Holly took special care to keep out of the way of the Slytherins. Broomstick practice had become much easier. Most of the better students quickly passed the course, leaving the slower, more cautious students to continue their practice. Albus passed early, but he often joined the class with his friend Taylor O'Daniel to keep the slower Gryffindors company, and because they both loved an excuse to fly. Holly and Becky both continued to make progress on their brooms, but it was clear neither would become expert flyers. Holly loved to visit Hagrid's hut and watch the lizard grow. The relative isolation of his hut made it a perfect place free of invading emotions, enabling Holly to relax and giving Sasha a chance to play. Becky talked Holly into joining the school choir. Professor Flitwick had heard them singing in the hall after class one day and told them he needed more students for the choir. Becky had apparently sung at her last school and was eager to do more. Holly had never before sung in public, but after one day in practice, she was hooked. 15 singing students, united in common purpose and sound, felt positively exhilarating. Holly never needed Sasha on her shoulder during choir practice. Their first performance would be for the school Halloween party, traditionally held Halloween evening. Holly's only problem was her failure to get a direction with her emotions. Madame Pomfrey refused to let Holly advance to blocking emotions until Holly could sense their origins. Try as she might, Holly just couldn't get the hang of it. She finally took the problem to a Hufflepuff house meeting, after which the other Hufflepuff students took to jabbing themselves unexpectedly with pins and challenging Holly to discover who had been jabbed. Though Holly could tell someone had been jabbed, she still couldn't tell whom. But occasionally she guessed right. One afternoon, Albus came up to Holly after herbology class with a serious look on his face. Holly, he said, we're holding a family memorial service on Halloween night right after the program, and we'd really like you to be there too. Can you come? Holly thought, family memorial? For whom? And why include her? But she was free, so she said, yeah, I guess, sure. Albus's face brightened. Thanks, he said. Then Holly asked, when and where? In front of the Defense Against the Dark Arts room, right after your last song, Albus replied. Gotta go. See you there, he sang out as he ran off to his next class. In front of the Defense Against the Dark Arts room? What an odd place to hold a memorial service. Holly had a wonderful time at the Hogwarts Halloween party. The ghosts turned up and mingled with the students. The hall tables had all sorts of food. Huge chocolate spider cakes, mud cookies, wand-shaped breadsticks. On each end was a large cauldron full of bubbling, blood-colored punch. For once, the decor fit the occasion. The school choir performed 6 songs, all with appropriate spooky topics. The one that drew the most applause was the final song, sung with harmonizing notes of 4 wailing ghosts that joined with the choir for the occasion. When the singing ended, Holly grabbed a mug of punch and a quick bite to eat. Then she saw Albus and Rose standing to one side waving at her, so she scooped up Sasha and hurried over to join them. Together they walked to the Defense Against the Dark Arts room. James was ready for them, waiting at the entrance of the Defense Against the Dark Arts room. He carried a small bag. "Right," he said. "We're all here. Are you ready?" Rose and Albus nodded solemnly. All 3 of them looked at the painting of Harry Potter and Lord Voldemort. Holly looked too. James pulled out his wand and pointed at the painting. In a commanding voice and a wave of his wand, he repeated the words beneath the painting. "Sometimes you've got to think about more than your own safety. Sometimes you've got to think about the greater good." To Holly's immense surprise, the painting was actually a sort of a door that swung open, revealing a room beyond. The 4 of them walked inside. The painting swung back like a door, closing the opening behind them. Sasha jumped off Holly's shoulder and walked ahead. The room was a semicircle. The back wall curved to meet the sides up next to the opening. It was softly lit. The back wall had a lavender-colored bottom which, while they watched, gradually turned dark purple, then midnight blue. That blue blended into the black of night, and on the walls were flecks of silver and gold that seemed to flash and twinkle at random like twinkling stars at night. Over the gold and silver flecks were the words, "In Memorandum," written in gold. Entranced, Holly moved forward and looked closer at the wall. The flecks were actually names, hundreds of them, all sparkling, changing from silver to gold to silver, shining brightly against the dark background. Holly reached up high and touched one of the names. Immediately, a shaft of gold light shot out of the name. Holly jumped back in surprise. The shaft of light stopped just above Holly's head and formed a figure of a person. It was a lady in wizard robes and broad, square jaw and very short gray hair. She adjusted her monocle and looked sternly out at Holly. Beneath the person, Holly read the words, "Amelia Susan Bones." Beneath it was a date. The figure pivoted in a slow circle and then vanished in a shower of stars. Holly touched another name. A handsome young man shot out of the light. He waved as he pivoted in front of her. Beneath it was the name Dirk Cresswell and a year. "Hey, this one doesn't move," shouted Albus. Holly turned to look. Both Albus and Rose were pressing names also, watching the figures appear in front of them. Holly looked again at the wall. Colin Creevey? She knew that name from somewhere. Then she saw another name and froze. Cedric Diggory. "Remus Lupin?" Albus's voice spoke out again. "That's Ted's dad, isn't it?" "Uncle Fred's name is on the wall." Rose spoke uncertainly. They all slowly turned to James, who had been standing quietly behind them, waiting. "Are these all names?" began Rose, putting to words what the 3 of them had begun to realize. "Of people that Her voice trembled. "Voldemort killed?" James nodded solemnly. "Or his supporters," he confirmed. Holly shivered. The room no longer seemed a clear evening night with twinkling stars above, but a black tomb weighed down by the ghosts and names of the dead. "So many people," she whispered. "Lord Voldemort was not a nice guy," said James. "I don't think I like this place," spoke up Albus. Holly looked at Albus and Rose. Both of them had tears streaming down their faces. She, too, felt close to tears. James turned to the other side of the door. "Look," he said, directing their attention to a parchment posted on the wall next to a group photograph. The parchment was labeled Dumbledore's Army. James used his wand and touched the name Dumbledore's. Immediately, gold-colored words shot out into space in front of them. Holly, Rose, and Albus read, "A group of students organized by Harry Potter to practice defensive magic to be used against Lord Voldemort and his followers." The words vanished. The four studied the parchment. "There's Dad's name," said James, pointing out the signature of Harry Potter. "And Mum's," piped up Albus, pointing to another. "And look," said Rose, pointing eagerly to two other signatures. "That's Mum and Dad's. And Uncle Fred's and George's." Even Holly saw a few names she recognized. Neville Longbottom, Luna Lovegood, Colin Creevey. One name had been scratched out, and she couldn't read it. "This is what we're really here for," said James. He pointed to the group photo posted next to the parchment. Above it was the label, Order of the Phoenix. He placed his wand on the title, and again words jumped out in space to be read. "A group of wizards organized by Albus Dumbledore to fight against Lord Voldemort and his followers." "Look," he said, pointing to some people in the photo. "There's Professor Longbottom's parents." "Oh," said Rose, moving up for a closer look. "They look so young." "And happy," added Albus. "There's Professor Hagrid," continued James, pointing again, "and Albus Dumbledore. You were named after him, Albus." Albus and Rose peered eagerly at the photos showing an elderly wizard with long white beard. Holly remembered seeing his portrait in the headmistress's office. "There, that's Remus Lupin, Ted's dad," continued James, pointing to another person. He nudged some of the people in the photo, and they moved aside to let others into view. "Look here," he said, pointing to two people who had just moved into view. "That's Grandpa James Potter, sitting there." Albus moved up for a closer look. "And sitting over there is Grandma Lily." "Lily?" Holly gave a start and looked more closely at the person James was pointing to. The Lily in the portrait had long blonde hair and looked vaguely familiar. She looked up and smiled at the photographer. Wordlessly, Holly looked up at James. "Professor Hagrid says you look a lot like her," said James. James pulled out some candles and handed one to each of them, keeping one for himself. Then he spoke to Albus. "Go over to the flames and light your candle, please." He pointed to a niche on the other side of the door where Holly saw a single flame burning. Holly read the inscription above the flame. "Dedicated to those people whose names we shall never know, who died because of Lord Voldemort and his followers." Albus lit his candle and returned. James placed the lit candle upon the ledge beneath the photo. Everyone watched the flame. It flickered brightly, lighting the smiling faces of James and Lily Potter. "Every year on Halloween, Mum and Dad light a candle in memory of Grandma and Grandpa Potter," James explained. "So I thought it would be appropriate for us to light a candle for them here, too." Albus and Rose nodded. "But what you probably don't know, mostly because they never talk about it, is how they died, and how those deaths affect all of us standing here tonight." James cleared his throat and looked over at the three before speaking. 30 years ago, he began, a very evil wizard was on his rise to power. He called himself Lord Voldemort. People who stood up to him usually got killed. So the Order of the Phoenix was formed, with the sole purpose of trying to stop Lord Voldemort. Grandma and Grandpa Potter were members of it. James stopped talking for a moment and looked up at the photo of smiling people. Then he added softly, "Most of the people in this photo are dead now." James resumed his informative voice. "On October 31, 1981, Lord Voldemort came to the Potter house. When the smoke cleared, James and Lily Potter were dead. But their 1-year-old son Harry was found still alive. What's more, Lord Voldemort was nowhere to be seen. People all over the wizarding world rejoiced that the reign of terror was finally over. They celebrated because Harry Potter had obviously taken a killing curse and not only survived, but somehow defeated Lord Voldemort. That's when he got that scar on his forehead." Holly thought about this. "I don't understand," she began, interrupting his narrative. "If Cousin Harry defeated Lord Voldemort when he was age 1, how come, well, what about the Hogwarts battle?" James nodded. "I don't exactly know what happened, but they were obviously mistaken about Lord Voldemort being dead. Harry went to live with his only surviving relatives, his Muggle aunt and uncle. He looked at Holly. "Your grandparents," he said, speaking to her directly. Then James continued his narrative. When Dad reached age 11, he attended Hogwarts. He met Uncle Ron and Aunt Hermione that first year. Rose's parents, he added for Holly's benefit, and they became best friends. Uncle Ron said people used to point and whisper behind Dad's back and call him the boy who lived. In Dad's 4th year, Hogwarts hosted the Triwizard Tournament, James continued. Lord Voldemort's supporters used the tournament as an opportunity to capture Dad and use him in some weird, nasty ritual to create a new body. Here James digressed from his story. That's the only time I could find that Dad ever spoke in public about his experience with Lord Voldemort. I found an interview he gave in the Quibbler. It's pretty scary reading. Anyway, he continued, Lord Voldemort apparently tried to kill Dad again, but somehow Dad got away. Unfortunately, people didn't believe that Lord Voldemort had returned. At least that's what the Daily Prophet said. So Dad and the other students formed Dumbledore's army to combat him. James paused to catch his breath. By the end of Dad's 5th year, people were finally convinced Lord Voldemort had returned, but they couldn't catch him, let alone stop him. After Dad's 6th year, the Ministry of Magic started issuing all sorts of anti-Muggle laws. Wizards with Muggle parents were rounded up and thrown in prison along with their families. Only students of pure-blood wizard parents were permitted to attend Hogwarts. People just disappeared. Others were found brutally murdered, and the murderers never caught. The Daily Prophet said that Dad was wanted for questioning in the death of Hogwarts headmaster Albus Dumbledore, but Mum says that was just an excuse to lock Dad up. It's pretty clear the Ministry of Magic was under the control of Lord Voldemort during this time. Dad, Uncle Ron, and Aunt Hermione went into hiding. I talked to Mum about that. She said the three had been planning on it for some time. Uncle Ron had gotten the house ghoul to dress up in his clothes. The ghoul pretended he was Uncle Ron with a bad case of spattergoit. Aunt Hermione sent her Muggle parents to Australia with modified memories, so they couldn't be found and wouldn't miss her if she died. James paused and looked at Holly as if waiting for something. Holly cleared her throat and added another piece to the story. My grandparents were given new identities, she said softly. They were protected with all sorts of magical spells to keep them safe from Lord Voldemort. James nodded. I figured as much, he said. It was the only time things like that were done. He cleared his throat and continued. There isn't much to say after that. While Lord Voldemort was in charge, people went into hiding, went missing, were arrested and thrown into jail, or flat out died. All the while, there were wanted posters out on Dad. Mum went to Hogwarts at that time. She said it was a pretty grim place. Over half the students were gone, and the remainders were mostly Slytherins. Unforgivable curses were used as punishment, and the classes were full of anti-Muggle propaganda. Mum and the rest of the family had to go into hiding after Easter when the Death Eaters finally figured out Uncle Ron was with Dad. At the end of the school year, Dad, Uncle Ron, and Aunt Hermione returned to Hogwarts. There was this big battle and, well, you know what happened then. James was quiet for a minute. Then he finished his narrative saying, All our lives are bound up in the actions of Lord Voldemort. And that started with the death of James and Lily Potter. They all watched the flame burning steadily, lighting up the smiling faces of James and Lily Potter. Then Rose spoke up. Wherever you are, whatever you are, we remember you, James and Lily Potter, and wish you well. She lifted her candle, lit it, and placed it next to the first. James and Holly lit theirs as well, placing them next to Rose's candle. They stood together quietly, watching the 4 flames burning brightly in the dark room. Then they left, leaving the burning candles behind. It was fairly late by the time they finished their memorial ceremony. James, Albus, and Rose walked with Holly to the Hufflepuff Tower before parting company. Thank you for inviting me, Holly said softly. I'm glad you could come, replied James. The others nodded in agreement. Goodbye, said Rose with a smile. Yeah, see you later, Holly, said Albus. Holly walked slowly up the stairs to her dormitory. She had a lot to think about. The angry face in the courtroom painting met her, and gruffly asked, "Password?" Holly thought. She couldn't think of anything funny to say. Then she remembered what Gwen had said about descriptions. She gathered her thoughts and softly said, "I saw the most beautiful room tonight. It was all velvety dark and filled with gold and silver lights that twinkled like stars. I could almost hear the crickets chirping. But then I realized all those stars were really the names of people, ever so many people, real people, not just names. And all those people died because of Lord Voldemort and it was so sad." The face in the painting began to cry. He pulled out a handkerchief and brought it to his eyes. Soon the whole courtroom joined in, crying, reflecting Holly's own feelings. The portrait swung open. "Go on in," sobbed the face, wiping the tears from his face. "You need some cheering up." "Thank you," whispered Holly, and she stepped inside.